Hello, friends. Welcome to the Logistics of Logistics podcast. My name is Joe Lynch. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's topic is $1 trillion in freight transactions with my friend Ken Adamo, or Adamo. You decide.
You decide.
Welcome, Ken. Please introduce yourself and your company and where you're calling from today.
I am Ken Adamo. I'm Chief of Analytics over here at DAT. I am coming to you from Northeast Ohio, from the boonies of outside of Akron or Kent, Ohio, probably the two nearest landmarks, but that's where I'm currently at.
Home of old tire plants and the Black Keys.
Black Keys, yeah. Yes, the old main boulevard downtown is named after them at this point. And LeBron James. You forgot probably the most actual.
That's right. I'm a bigger Black Keys fan than a basketball fan. So anyway, so Ken, what does DAT do for people who live under a rock or aren't in the freight business?
So we're the largest freight marketplace in North America, connecting shippers, brokers, and carriers. My side of the world is the largest analytical operation in freight and logistics. So we offer insight around capacity, around pricing, bid response, forecasting, all of that fun stuff to shippers, carriers, and brokers. In addition to wrangling a lot of data internally and externally.
Yeah, it's funny. 10 years ago, you probably used the data, but didn't necessarily tell everybody, hey, we've got all this great data. Now it's more and more like, hey, we have fantastic data that the world wants to consume. So let's walk through this and just give me the kind of the quick version. You mentioned you serve brokers, carriers, and shippers. So let's start with brokers. What do you do for brokers? Let's say I'm a freight broker and I'm listening to this podcast. What can you do to help me improve my business?
I'd say the most common use case for brokers is helping them buy a truck. So they've got to load, they've got to move. A lot of brokerages are split shops, which means they have carrier sales and shipper sales. And so the load may have already been sold to the shipper, or you might be a smaller broker and you just made the sale to your customer, the shipper, and now you've got to buy a truck. Some of them may be looking at our rates when they're making the actual quote to the shipper, if they're doing everything in one seat. But ultimately, we collect and aggregate $1 trillion now of historical market data and use that to infer prevailing market rates in given markets. So it's a great starting point. I to people at cocktail parties or Cub Scout events, of which I am a den leader. I'll describe it as the Kelley Blue Book or the True Car pricing guidance that you would get when buying a used car or a new car, I guess now. But it's those holistic benchmarks aggregated from all the dealerships buying and selling. It's the same deal with how brokerages are buying and selling out there.
Yep. So if I'm a carrier, how does that help me with my business?
So what we know, it's the hardest part of our job. I tell it to every candidate that comes on board is that we serve a huge portion of the Fortune 500 and we serve 1.5 million truckers doing business on this little thing every day. So the most common way that carriers consume our analytical data is in the DAT One mobile app. So they see a load, depending on their subscription package, they'll see the market rate sitting there right underneath the origin, destination, equipment type, and then any kind of special requirements. So it might say Atlanta to Chicago, one pick, one drop, 45,000 pounds of freight of all kinds. And DAT is reporting the market rate on that lane at $2.25 a mile. That's how a carrier typically consumes it, right? They're very transactional in nature. They're rolling down the road, trying to sell their capacity for as much as possible.
So if DAT says it's 225, can they say, I want 226?
Yeah, so just like anything else, right? Like my father took pride in getting his car below Kelley Blue Book, right? He would not walk out of that dealership unless he bought that car, even off family friends who were car salesmen, unless it was under Kelley Blue Book. So I think for most folks that are operating purely in the transactional market, it's a starting point. Let's say it's a hazmat load. It's almost certainly going to go for way above 225 a mile. Let's say it's a light load with a 3-day lead time. It's probably going to go underneath. All of these estimates are distributions, so they're a bell curve. And that's probably the second hardest part of my job is explaining that to the broker and carrier base, that it's not a point. There is no market price for transportation, like a single point. It's such a disintermediated, such a distributed and fragmented industry that It's really the culmination of millions of negotiations that happen throughout the course of a day, a week, a month, a year.
Yep. So let's say I'm a shipper and I say, yes, why should I use DAT? And I know you have some new tools and we'll talk about those in a minute, but in general, what do shippers get from working with DAT?
So the most common shipper use cases, they sign up with us, we onboard them, they send every single North American truckload, LTL, and intermodal transaction that they handle on a weekly basis. And we run that through our advanced AI models, and it spits back what they should have paid to move that load. So for shippers, it's very much a benchmarking. They're largely out there looking out ahead over the horizon. If a shipper's moving most of their freight in the spot market, they're in a pretty bad way, right? Most shippers are maybe moving 10 to 15% in this market on the spot, and a lot of that goes through brokers. So I think 85+% of our shippers are looking down the road, what lanes are performing well, what lanes are performing poorly, what carriers are performing well, what carriers are performing poorly. Um, and they're using it to guide their business that
Yep.
way.
And just before COVID, which seems like it's beginning to be kind of a distant memory, just before COVID, I was on a project and it was finishing up, and I'd helped a very large shipper select a transportation company. And I remember as it was wrapping up, I said, I want to make sure that we have the DAT trend line on your monthly. I want to be able to see. And they say, well, should we be above or below DAT? And I said, parallel. I don't care if you're above it or below it. I just don't want to see that the market price went down while your price was going up. I just want to just a little kind of want to be tethered to that line in some predictable way.
That's what it really comes down to. That's a hard point to get across to a lot of folks is that, the best brokers in the industry, whether they're large or small, they know where they're dialed in compared to DAT. They know that, hey, I buy 3.5% above DAT. I buy 7% below DAT, and that's all I really need to know. And it varies by equipment type, but that's kind of the best practice.
So because of their spend and because of the company they chose, I thought they'll be way below the DAT trend line. And when they were actually above it, I was like, okay, this is difficult because it's a lot of appointments. Okay, it's above it. And I'm good with that. It wasn't, and I remember saying, there's no need to panic. It's a trend line. I want to make sure that I don't deviate from it. And again, I don't think most shippers particularly care if they have a good relationship and their freight is moving on in a way that's appropriate. They're not going to say, "Oh, we're 1% above DAT. I want to blow this up."
One of my colleagues, Chris Kaplis up at MIT, it's actually interesting. It's not true. It's a freight myth. The larger shippers don't have actual economies of scale. It actually sometimes goes the other way because their needs are so, like Walmart and others don't necessarily get better per mile pricing. Now, where do they have leverage? They have leverage on service and standards and scheduling and payment terms. They're able to exert their leverage elsewhere. But on a per mile basis, we don't really see a ton of economies of scale happening with different
That's
shippers.
interesting. By the way, I have interviewed Chris Kaplis. I'll make sure I put a link to that in the show notes. It wasn't
Yeah, he's awesome. I was just talking to him this morning.
It wasn't in relation to his DAT job. It was in relation to his program over at MIT. But I heard somebody say this. I don't know. You tell me whether this is true or not. Somebody said, yeah, some locations, Walmart, I think, had very nice, you could drop off, and there was a nice shipper lounge with Wi-Fi and a couch and showers and big TV. And they said, some drivers will go to that location for cheaper, even up to a dime cheaper.
Or if you know that there's a gate attendant that's there an hour before and will stick around if they know a shipment's coming in until an hour after the yard typically closes, that could be the make or break. If you know there's a really mean yard attendant that doesn't get you a door right away, it could be, you're putting, the intricacies of what happens on the shipper side are a lot more broad reaching because it usually affects maybe 3 or 4 loads a day as opposed to the spot market, which is like this particular load that I'm moving. So being a shipper of choice, I think, really comes through there more than on the spot market.
Yep. So we got lots to cover here. But first, Ken, tell us a little bit about you. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to school? Some career highlights before you join the juggernaut that is DAT or DAT. You guys haven't decided yet.
Yeah, it's both. Yeah, so I grew up around the Pittsburgh area. I'm a huge Pittsburgh professional sports fan. I came out here to Ohio to go to school. I did my undergrad at Akron. Go Zips. So that's where I spent some time. And then I kind of came through college at the depths of the Great Recession and spent some time at a local deregulated energy company, which was great. That's markets were deregulating, and we had an opportunity to make large commercial inroads, and the analytics are super fun. Anyone who's worked around energy knows that it's very ripe for analytics, and that's how you can get an edge. Um, you might spend 6 months figuring out how 10,000 homes that have an electric hot water tank differ from ones with a gas one. But if you can figure that out, you can make millions and millions and millions of dollars serving that load cheaper. But those things get kind of dicey as markets turn, as we all know about Enron and others. So I flipped over to FedEx, which had an operating presence here in Northeast Ohio. One of their operating companies, Custom Critical, was headquartered out here. My first project at FedEx was working with DAT data to build better pricing models. So, that's where I got into the transportation game. Thought it would be a boring, quick stop. It was not. I kind of really fell in love with the puzzle that is logistics. Um, Eventually, we were using DAT and other data sources to price hundreds of millions of dollars of freight. I was bopping around all of the FedEx operating companies, and DAT was like, "Hey, why don't you just come work for us?" So I was one of the OG remote employees. I joined in December of 19, and then the world fell apart, and everyone was remote. So they all joined me in the deep end of the pool as I was figuring it out. Um, but yeah, I've been here coming up on 5 years this December. I head up all of our analytics teams. I just recently took on Corp Dev, all the M&A and partnership stuff that we do here at JT.
I was talking to Georgia from your company
Yeah,
yesterday
George
in
is awesome.
marketing. And she said, yeah, Ken's got a new role. And I asked, because I said, is Ken still doing the podcast? She said, no, he's got a new role where he's responsible not only for the data analytics, but for corporate development. What is corporate development?
So for us, it's building a better partner presence in the industry. All of our trucks that are in our network, they have to park, they have to pay tolls, they have to get, they have to fuel, they have to factor. So it's really just being a better partner in the industry and putting some heat and light on that function for us. And then our parent company, Roper, is an M&A machine. They deploy a considerable amount of capital every year. And it's just putting some focus on that from a Roper and DAT perspective, having boots on the ground, what's happening in the freight space.
Yeah, that's the partnership thing is a big deal these days because I'm assuming a lot of your trucking companies are using their mobile phones to access DAT. And I've also heard people say, I've been doing this podcast 6.5 years, and I'm sure you probably heard some of the same things. A lot of companies will say, oh, all you have to do is download it onto your phone. So if you're a driver, you just download it on the phone and we'll track you wherever you're at. Even if you go up north to your cottage, we'll track you, right? And we, I think as an industry realized, hey, there's going to be app fatigue. And so not everybody needs to have a marketplace like DAT. I think in a lot of ways, we need to have standard marketplace, and I think we're starting to see that. There's a reason you guys have $1 trillion worth of transactions is because it became a standard. So people are going to download your app, but they don't need to download every new VC-backed company. Unless there's some real value in it, I don't see every driver saying, oh yeah, it's really easy to do my job. I have 16 apps that I downloaded. I don't think they want to work that way.
Yeah, that's really it. And we've always had a partnership presence. We've partnered with several companies in the industry, but this is really just about being more strategic as we look, as we grow and we look around the industry. Like what are the right partnerships to have for us? We want to partner with other industry leading firms in their particular categories, and also like partner where it doesn't make sense for us. We want to build and maintain our core swim lanes. And we want to partner where it can add value to our customers without us having to own it ourselves.
Yep. So you can tell them where to park, where to fuel up, what would be some other things that you could help them with the
Well, pretty much a large majority of carriers factor their receivables from brokers. We have great factoring relationships in the industry. Um, there's it's not just on the carrier side either, right? A lot of brokers want to factor their payment terms have become this huge thing in the industry where, shippers are pushing 90-day payment terms and you got to pay your carrier in 15 days maybe. So there's factoring there, there's payment processing, document management. Shippers are turning to partners to help them manage their bids, to help them manage their vendors. A lot of like ERP systems don't work very well for transportation. A lot of finding out, right? Like your office supply vendor is a little different than 85,000 pounds, 80,000 pounds driving down the road, point to point. So it's I think it's a space that's really interesting for us. It's interesting for me. I've been doing the analytics thing, managing the product and engineering teams for my entire tenure here. So it's a fun little. You asked where I went to school. I also got my MBA from the Ohio State University. Everyone likes to tease me. They were just defeated by the Oregon Ducks. I might add.
I watched that game. Those are the two best teams in the country, I think.
I think you're probably right. I think we'll see each other again. You can see my Buckeyes are hanging right here.
Yeah. Well, forgive me. I'm a Wolverine. You'll have to put up
I
with
know.
it
I know.
I will say though, I watched that game the other night, and I was just had this conversation at lunch. One of my friends called me, and then another called, and we were talking about football. And a fourth friend had sent us all the message that I don't know that Ohio State or Oregon are top 5 teams because they can't play defense. I was like, wrong. I said, those are elite defenses, but those are also elite offenses.
Yeah. I think on a neutral field, I would take the Buckeyes in a repeat. But I know that the Wolverines are in for a world of hurt coming down to Columbus this year. They are not in a good way.
No,
they are not in a good way.
This is we will improve between now and then, but we will not be favored in that game by any stretch. I don't think so.
I'll be there. I have season tickets. I drive down to Columbus 6 or 7 times for the games.
I have Michigan tickets, so I do get to most of the games. But yeah, that's for years I sold my Buckeye tickets because the rabid Ohio State fans would pay me big money, and I was like, I'm not going to go watch us get beat.
I haven't seen them. So I got my season tickets, not to derail us. I got my season tickets 3 or 4 years ago. And so I've yet to see them beat Michigan in person.
You might this year.
And with COVID, they canceled that game. So I wasn't there for that. So once they beat them in person, you're right. It's like 15 where I sit. It's like I could sell them for $1,500 a piece. My wife wants to wring my neck because I'm like, I have to go see it.
Yeah. I've had the same season tickets since they were my dad's. My dad had the same name. So before my dad died, he changed the tickets to my address. And so we've had the same tickets since the 60s. Anyway, more about football later. We'll do another podcast just about football. So I wanted to talk to you about 4 things today. And the first is this $1 trillion milestone that you guys hit. What is that? That's the name of the title of our podcast, is $1 trillion in freight transactions. What does that mean?
So part of this, right, is a lot of the companies that compete in this space, the way density is everything in logistics. You know this. You've been doing this a long time. And so the way that companies market how good their analytics are, kind of the way that everyone can understand is how much data do you have? And given that you could have 1 million LTL shipments and 1 million RGN high value flatbed shipments, those have very different transactional values, right? Like so the industry standard that is morphed is how many loads do you have in your database and what's the total transaction value? And that's what shippers and brokers want to know when they're making a buying decision. So it's that farmer's commercial, right? We know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two. So when we say $1 trillion, we mean if you added up every transaction in our database going back 13 years now, the total would be over $3 trillion or over $1 trillion of total freight spend.
Right. Yep. And Ken, you know this far better than I, but I've had some conversations, not on the podcast necessarily, where people talk about, oh, we created this new load board. And I'm kind of the opinion we don't need a new load board. We need the ancillary tools, perhaps. Those are all great, the killer apps that we're developing. But what's interesting is they don't get the density for everywhere. So they have a whole bunch of carriers in one spot, or let's just say 10 spots, and then they have shippers in other spots. So they'll say things like, oh, we have 100,000 carriers on our system and we have 10,000 shippers. But there isn't, it's it's like matching on a dating app, and you go, oh, I matched with 10 people. They're in China, Africa, and Europe. I'm in the United States. Not helpful. And that's one of the challenges we've had with some of these load boards. If you don't have a lot of transactions, you don't have anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's about having a truck when you need it and a load where you need it, right? And it's if you don't have density, I mean, it's you can try any one of like rhetorical devices to explain it, but ultimately, like if you have a party with one person, it's pretty boring. If you have a party with two people, it's maybe not as boring, but I wouldn't quite call it a party. But like once you get to like 7, 8, 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 people, the connections, right? You start to see it break off into clusters and clicks form. That's what happens in freight networks. So it's really the $1 trillion milestone, though, right? Is less about load board because none of the data comes from the load board. That's a huge differentiator for us. All of our data comes directly from the systems of our customers, so it's all verified and validated, cleansed data. And so I think the same principle applies, right? You want to have a rate that's informed by more than one broker, more than one carrier, more than one like market condition. And I think that's where having that density, and also like we've all seen it, right? The coyote curve, you call it whatever you want. This history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, which is a cliche, but it's true. So we're able to go pull into the Wayback Machine and look at what market conditions were like in 2010, 2011, 2012. And that's a big deal for us.
Oh yeah, and by the way, this is DAT stands for Dial a Trucker, right? So is this a pre-internet company?
Yeah, we were founded 46 years ago, I think, officially. Jubit's Truck Stop in Portland, Oregon. The monitors on hanging in truck stops with payphones. If you saw a load you wanted, you dialed in and you got the load from the broker or the shipper, and you were rolling down the road.
It was pretty high tech back then.
DAT actually predates deregulation by 2 years, right? We were founded in 78, I believe.
Nice. So let's switch gears. So anyway, the significance, the importance of the $1 trillion is you have the density, you have the data, and you've been doing it for long enough that I say this all the time now, raw data doesn't do you much good. You need somebody who knows how to normalize it, clean it up. I joke about the term dirty data. If we start filling our AI algorithms with dirty data, we just get more dirty data. And you guys have been cleaning it up and getting better every day since you said over 40 years.
That's right. That's what we try to do anyway.
So your role has changed. So you're now in charge of the corporate development, and you're not doing the podcast anymore. But let's talk about the podcasts you guys have over at DAT, just the same. What are your two I think you had two podcasts. Do you still have two podcasts?
Yeah, we have Freight Vine with Chris Kaplis. That's more shipper industry focused. He has luminaries from supply chain and academia on. They're longer form, audio only conversations. Very, put it on in the car when you've got a trip and you can learn something. And then Dean and I started the weekly IQ show in the depths of COVID.
That's Dean Croak, right?
Dean Croak, yeah. And that started with a virtual whiteboard and sticky notes, just to kind of go live. And it kind of morphed into if we miss a week, our customers let us know about it. Like they use it to inform their weekly operations. And it got to a point, our job as leaders is to strengthen our bench too. So Chad Kennedy is tagged in and is doing a great job. He's our product manager for our shipper products. So Dean and Chad and I'll pop in from time to time, but just given my schedule, it's been really, really hard to commit to Tuesday mornings.
I was supposed to interview you years ago, and it just kind of went off the rails because you had a very difficult schedule. And the person who told me, I think, to interview you was Dean Croak. He was one of the early people on my podcast. And he said, yeah,
he's great. And look, I think I also have 4 kids, all boys. So my life is quite the hectic disaster. It's sometimes travel a lot, when there's not a calamity happening at home. But
you have 4 boys. There's always a calamity at home.
That's my point. Yeah, there's never a dull moment. Never at all.
So what I'll do is I'll put a link to both of those podcasts. I have listened. And by the way, I did talk to Chris Kaplis on my podcast. What I talked to him about the program that he's one of the leaders of a supply chain program at MIT that I think it's the future. I honestly think it's the future. And by the way, before I forget, I also was at CSCMP, and I think one of the keynotes of CSCMP was the head of supply chain program at the Ohio State University. I talked
Dr.
to
Terry
him.
Esper.
Yep, I just spoke to him. He's going to come on the podcast. So
He's wonderful. He was my teacher in my Ohio State program. So I think
he was a great speaker at
yeah,
CSCMP.
he's one of the best. I think they do like a revolving chair that every few years, and it's his turn to do it. I think he's rounding out his term doing that. But yeah, like I said, he was one of my professors at Ohio State, and I think the world of Terry.
It's funny. No one ever thinks of Michigan or Ohio as logistics capitals, but we are where the supply chain was born and where it still is strongest. Yep. But
The
even
auto
beyond,
industry and all the tier one suppliers, that's kind of the cradle of North American, especially truckload and expedite. That is the cradle of logistics in this country.
I just saw this thing and it had a rectangle that you could kind of draw around the Midwest over to Pittsburgh, down halfway through Ohio, up to halfway through Michigan. And it said, this is the largest manufacturing hub in the world. And if it was its own country, it'd be the second largest GDP. So it is, even with what you always think of Ohio, Michigan, these you go, oh yeah, that's a place everyone's from, where you move somewhere else because there's no work. We're still doing stuff here.
Yeah, and like Pittsburgh seeing a massive renaissance in, through Carnegie Mellon, and Uber has a big presence there through their robotics and engineering programs. So it's a good time to be here.
Yep. Yep. And let's face it, this is where the football's best, guys. I'm sorry. Um, so let's move on to point 3. I wanted to talk to you about this DAT IQ. What is that?
Yeah, so I don't know, maybe a year or so into my tenure here, we realized we had a bunch of solutions, but not like one holistic umbrella to put them all underneath. And that's really where that was born. It's one brand for all of our analytics products is DAT IQ, and then one brand for all of our freight matching products, which is DAT1. That's where that largely came from. But when I think of it, it's all of the insight that comes out of our shop that powers our apps, our presence in the industry, these kind of discussions, that all gets branded under that moniker of DAT IQ. It's everything we talked about. It's how you sell your truck. It's how you buy a truck. It's how you do a bid or design a network. It's all of those things tied into one.
So now I know some of this, I'm probably going to get this wrong, so please push me into the shallow end, Ken. You guys had some enhanced tools. Last time I spoke to someone from DAT, they were talking about more tools for shippers. What is that part of the DAT IQ, or is that Lane IQ?
So we bought FMIC. We bought FMIC from Chainalytics about 3 or so years ago. They were a shipper benchmarking consortium almost exclusively. They did some 3PL work. We had some shippers in our network. They weren't a huge focus historically. Once we bought FMIC, it really upped our focus there, and it's grown really, really well for us. That's been a very prosperous section of our business through this freight recession that has been so called, because shippers largely, they aren't in a recession. They're playing a lot of golf, right? Because they're getting great rates and they're not getting stressed on service. But the shipper, the benefit of having this multi-sided network is when one's down, that the other side's generally up, right? When shippers are hurting because they're getting really high rates and they're getting raked over the coals, that means brokers and carriers are doing well. When brokers and carriers are seeing lower rates and compressed margins, that usually means that shippers, they're hitting their budgets. So it's been a focus for us. We completely revamped that product. We took it out of its legacy platform. It's all in our flagship IQ platform now. We just did that last year. We replaced all of the back-end modeling with AI and machine learning, as opposed to more, I don't want to say older school because regression still makes the world go round, but more kind of rudimentary regression techniques. It just helps with a more accurate benchmarking capability for our shippers.
Yep. I know this might be like I live in utopia over here, but I I like working with companies. And I remember when I was still at a 3PL, we had a shipper, and they were an automotive shipper from the Japanese transplants. And I remember they would ask us on a regular basis, are we a good customer? Are you making money from us? Because we really like what you're doing for us and we want to make sure you're successful. And I think how seldom we hear that kind of talk from our shippers. And I think that's crazy because the difference between us making money and them, not making money is not a ton of money. It's not like we're saying, hey, you have to go bankrupt so we can be good. I think we got to get out of this zero sum game with carriers, brokers, and shippers. I want my broker partners and my carrier partners to do well if I'm a shipper because I don't want to lose them. the idea that I'm working with them and at some point they call and say, hey, Joe, it's official. We're out of business. We can't help you anymore. Like, who's that helping?
Yeah, I mean, I think like that's where most supply chain activity happens, frankly. I think we hear a lot about these edge cases and these bias kind of instances where shippers ground a broker or a carrier into bankruptcy or, shippers. I think by and large, you're seeing the industry shift a little bit away from price on the shipper side. And it's always been, if you ask a shipper, in my experience, if you asked a shipper price versus service, they would pick service 99 times out of 100. They don't want to get ripped off, but they would rather have service over price. I just think like more and more with the transparency that have been brought into markets, price is becoming less and less of a factor, and service, reliability, communication. Like if you ask the shipper, would you save 5% for a carrier that only has 50% ELD tracking compliance? The answer is probably going to be no.
Right.
Right? Or for damage and claims rates. I think shippers have really turned the focus more. And that's what markets do, right? Markets make the rate setting much more effective and efficient, more so than effective.
I told this story once or twice on the podcast, but I'll say it again because it was a lesson I learned a long time ago. Friend of a friend was at a company, and they were having a little bit of trouble with their shipping, and it was truckload, and we mostly did the LTL stuff. And I remember said, yeah, we can help you with that truckload. And they said, we move lotto tickets. And I was like, oh, okay. So it was lotto tickets from Michigan to Louisiana. And they said, just FYI, if these should be more than 2 days late, if as soon as it's 2 or as soon as 3 days late, whatever it was, we have to call the FBI because these are lotto tickets. And I was like, it's not going to be 3 days late to Louisiana. Trust me. Well, I went back, we won the business, but the rate was so low that with none of the carriers that we normally worked with would take it. So then my ops team is chasing around and they finally found a carrier. Guess what? A little substandard, but a little sketchy maybe. But we used them. They did the best they could, but they had an old truck and they broke down a few times. Cut to the chase. I talked to the FBI. And that was my first shipment with them. And I remember after I got it delivered, I called the friend of a friend and I said, it's crazy that you have something that the FBI has to be called and yet you're going with the lowest rate. I said, we didn't make any money on this. I said, we made no money on this. And I said, it makes no sense that that you're at risk. I put myself and my reputation at risk. $100, $200 more would have changed everything. Nonsense.
Yeah, I think I can think of an example. We had a very high value fashion customer where they don't keep any inventory in the stores. They sweep every night back to it wasn't a distribution center, but it was like a centralized warehouse kind of situation. And it would come out of Southern California, and they couldn't go more than 250 miles before they could stop. They had to go 250 miles plus before they could make their first stop. You know the drill. And onboarded a new carrier onto that, hoping to save some money. I don't even know that it was so much money related, but it was just like to build a deeper bench there. And it was their first one. And honestly, I kid you not, they didn't egregiously violate the terms. They stopped at like 230 miles and went into a McDonald's. They came out, seal was broken, freight was not all of it, but the freight was stolen because it was such a short amount of time. And it just caused this huge kerfuffle. And it's like, you really only had one job. And like the rule was it was a team load and one of them had to be with the truck. So the other one could have ran in and got the McDonald's
Yeah, that's the nonsense. And by the way, there's been some carriers on my podcast in the last few years, and a few of them have said this. One in particular said, it was head of safety, big trucking company, said, "We are never the cheapest, but we are the safest. We have won a whole bunch of safety records, and we have the trophies to show for it. We have a well maintained fleet. Our drivers been with us for a long time. We have all the latest technology. We are 100% compliant to everything, but we're never the cheapest." And they say people buy from us because they share our values. We want it done right. We don't want anybody in the process to be abused or um, not make a good living. you know, everybody's got to be part. And if you have a team that you go, that same team's been with me for 20 years, same trucking company, you're getting good service.
I think there's like, the golden rules to do unto others as you would have done unto you. But there's like a silver rule, which is like you can have two of the three things I'm about to lay out for you: fast, good, and cheap. You can only have two.
Well, it's funny because the lean practitioner in me, I was an automotive guy for a long time, would always say, oh, Toyota gets all three.
Yeah, but I would argue that they're not the cheapest, right? I think like they, over the long arc of time, have found a way to optimize what they're doing.
Their manufacturing plants are so much cheaper. They have such an advantage there that they're able to spend elsewhere. But yeah, I get what you're saying. It's not a bad way to look at the world, as you can have two of the three.
Yeah,
and
you're right. You can and I think like
you're
there's carriers.
You're not as optimized as Toyota production system.
Yeah, if you fall slightly short of them, it's okay.
Exactly. Anyway, we talked about your new role. You get into the corporate development. We talked about the $1 trillion milestone. We talked about Lane IQ, DAT IQ. There's only a few people in the entire freight business who know where the market's going. And Ken, you're one of them. So tell us here, we're talking on October 16th, 2024. What's going on with the market? Tell us when the good news begins.
I don't think it's all. So obviously we've had some pretty bad natural disasters and some labor issues, but those have sort of kicked the market a little bit into gear heading into the fall retail peak. So this is our third month. September was our third month in a row on the dry van side on a positive year-over-year basis for spot. I suspect contract will follow. I think October will be that first year-over-year positive contract month.
So how positive are you talking? Like
3 to 5%. So not much.
So is it traditionally, what would that be? Like if it was really good news, what would it be? Rather than 3 to 5, would it be 7 or 8 or?
Yeah, I think when we start getting above 10%, people are feeling pretty good. A lot of their bonuses, a lot of their, targets and goals. The reason I like both, right? I think you need to look at year over year and sequential. The reason I like year over year is almost all businesses plan on a year over year basis. It's just the way that business works, right? I'm gold personally based on how much revenue and, margin growth I drive into the business on a year over year basis. Most freight brokers, carriers I know are comped in gold, and they're managing their business on reporting through year-over-year performance, right? So, the problem is the last two freight cycles have went from like flat to up 20% year-over-year in 3 months, right? You had think about 2017. You had Hurricane Harvey and Irma, just like huge generational weather events in major freight hubs, right? Houston is a lot different than Tampa from a freight perspective. And then you had ELDs in 17, and then you had the Trump tax cuts, you had changing tariff policies. You had like a perfect storm to drive rates up. The last, in 2020, we had obviously the pandemic. If you're a freight historian like I am, I would go back and look at like the summer of 2013, and what happened. You had about 6 or 7 months where rates just trickled above year over year averages. It was like 3, 5, 7, 3, then went back to 5. And then it didn't really start gaining momentum into that 10, 12, 15, 20% until retail peak hit. And that 2013 cycle lasted all the way until 2017. So that's kind of how I see it. This, absent any kind of regulatory, there was some news on AB5 today. The Supreme Court they chose not to hear the case from Postmates Uber.
Well, talk about what is AB5 for those who are not part of the day-to-day.
Yeah, that's the independent contractor classification, right? Where if you are behaving like an employee, you can't classify someone as a contractor. And it has big implications in freight, where a lot of, like, FedEx Ground is a great example.
But
Next time you get a FedEx,
Is that mostly California?
AB5 specifically is California, but there's a pretty big um, concern, I would say. I don't know how to word it. There's a thinking that it's going to go nationally. States will start adopting
Yeah,
this.
there was definitely under the Biden administration. They said we would like to see it go national, but it has some challenges in California. I've seen some. So that like if you had a rock band, I saw some of this a guy talking about it. He said, "I'm a musician. I have all sorts of band guys. I bring a piano player. And I want to pay him for the day to play the piano for a concert, and now I'm paying. Now he has to be an employee of my company for a day, and I have to pay, all this stuff like he's an employee." And it impacted a lot of the trucking companies who use a lot of owner operators. Am I right to say that?
Yeah, I mean, look at next time a FedEx Ground truck backs up to your house, look at their door, their driver's side door, because they're all independent contractors.
So did we see it's already in place, AB5? Did we see truckers move out of California into Nevada and other adjacent
We've
places?
seen it. It's hard to actually land on, like, ground source truth of that data. Like, it's certainly impacting, but a lot of them had their interstate motor authority anyway, right? It's just where their domicile maybe has changed, or their state of incorporation. Dean Croak's more of an expert on that than me, but if it goes national, it's certainly going to have pretty big implications. Yeah, leased on fleets are a big, big, big part of our industry, and agent model brokerages are a big part of our industry. Think about, like, Landstar agents or um, Armstrong.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of people who are just in contractor roles, and it's been fine. And by the way, that also is Uber and Lyft. I know Uber and Lyft is difficult because they say those have to be employees. And as soon as you make them employees, you say, you must work these hours because this is when we have a surge of business. Well, they say, I took the job at Lyft. I'm just doing air quotes job. I took the project with Lyft because I wanted flexibility. And now you're taking my flexibility away, making me an employee. Might work for some, but it's not going to work
Not
for
going
the
to work for all of
business.
them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's not. It's
they
yeah,
become a cab company.
yeah. So getting back to it, you see we hit bottom and now we're slowly coming off the bottom, but it's not a rapid ascent out of the depths. So when do you think when do you think we'll start feeling it more? Because I know I saw today it's not trucking companies, but it's brokerages. I saw Kevin Hill, who tracks how many brokerages there are. I said, hey, we're down to 25,000 freight brokers. There used to be 30,000, and we've been losing them. Um, and I'm assuming we're still losing carriers, or some carriers are losing trucks. Is that true to say?
It slowed down, though, right? Like that, we were losing a considerable number every month. We're down, not losing as many. Um, you saw JB Hunt publicly come out in their earnings and say that, they expect the worst to be behind us, and we're looking to positivity. Just to kind of, as we round to the top of the hour, I think what I would be happy going on record on is I think it'll be a pretty good peak season. It'll feel better than last year for sure. I think it'll slow down by the middle of January, when that return, all the returns have cleared the system. It gets slow every year, even during busy years, it gets slow. So I think that'll slow down, and then we'll see probably in earnest everyone's nodding in agreement. Like, you'll see like a lack of outliers claiming that it's not recovered, like the doomers. I think that'll all be flushed out of the system like produce season next year.
I can see why people felt like got a little doom and gloomy because it feels like this. I'm going to do air quotes again. This recovery is it's a few months late, 6 months late, a year late, whatever it is. It feels later than most people thought it would be.
Yeah, but I mean, it's, if you think about time value of money, right? Rates were up almost 70% during COVID, right? Everyone benefited. If you
They got
hauled a
flush.
similar amount, yeah, if you hauled a similar amount of freight every month over the last 4 years, it's still the most profitable 4 year swath in trucking in recent history. So, I mean, I think we all have a recency bias. If the cycle happened in reverse, I don't think anyone would be complaining right now. Um, and again, I know that doesn't help trucking companies. The problem is the market gets squeezed at every single turning point. I mean, think about it, right? Truckers were honking their horns in front of the White House in May of 2020. crippled by uh, impossibly low rates. And then we see the greatest 2-year run in trucking history. I mean, there were large publicly traded trucking companies posting ORs in the 70s. Like that never happens.
I talk to a lot of people in this business and they go, and I heard this a lot, dude, we got to buy a truck.
Yeah. And so they all bought trucks and it drove the rates down to historic, not historic, but near term historic lows. And here's where we are. And it'll get better. It's a cycle. It happens the same way every 4 years.
Yep. So Ken, I know sometimes we need some armies to leave the field. So we had some fewer trucks on them available. And I've heard other people, our friend Jason Miller, who uses DAT data and loves it. I know he's probably your biggest fan. Jason Miller from Michigan State said, Joe, we need an outside economic event. And he said, I was hoping in April that we'd see new housing starts would be greater, and that would trigger an uptick. Do you believe we need that outside economic? I mean, it'd be nice if we saw rate cuts or maybe incoming this April, new housing starts pop. Do we need that outside thing, or is this hurricane's going to be enough?
No, I think we need it. But I don't know that it has to be a big bang. I think if you got interest rates coming down where 30-year fixed rate mortgages are in that 5-ish% range, people buying new homes, people building new homes, that all catalyzes, shipping demand for consumer durables and non-durables. I think post-election, you're going to start to see some chips that have been sitting in people's pockets put on the table around manufacturing and warehousing bets, right? Depending on which way things go. Different strategies is what they would use. So I think the demand returning is somewhat inevitable. It's just when and how. And I think supply being trucks, we're probably at balance. We talked about this before going live. I think the trucks that have exited, we've lost about 10% of total over the road capacity is what I would estimate. Very rough estimation, by the way, but it's kind of probably where we're at. And that's probably where the reason I believe that we're at equilibrium is every time we see one of these shocks, the market behaves exactly as you would expect, and then it goes back to where it was. So you saw it with Road Check Week, you saw it with the blips with the hurricanes and the port strikes, and I think post-peak, you'll see the same thing. So without some sort of big steering current changing, mostly demand, or it could be supply, right? There's some big drug and alcohol clearinghouse. They're supposed to attach it to the CDL database. That could have a huge impact. AB5 is something we talked about, EPA emissions regulations. Speed limiters got punted till next year, but that could have a big impact on capacity. So,
well, also, who knows what's going to happen we'll have a new president soon, and who knows what that does, if it's tariffs or not tariffs. I mean, there's going to be all sorts of, I always say to people, don't believe what you hear from them, believe what we see. Right? So we will see whether we have some big changes that way. Anyway, I'm going to lose you. I want to wrap this bad boy up. So I'm going to summarize the best I can. Then I'm going to get your final thoughts on the topic. So I'm talking to my friend Ken, and we're talking about $1 trillion in freight transactions. So that was a big milestone that DAT hit. DAT's been around for a long time. They have a tremendous amount of data, and having $1 trillion worth of data transactions is significant. Means your data is, I'm guessing, the industry standard, which is pretty important at this 1 minute. I think any serious shipper, broker, or carrier is using DAT. Maybe some of the other tools like the load board, but probably, if not, for sure, they're using the data that comes from it. We also talked about your new role, not doing the podcast as much, but the podcasts are still alive and well. We'll put a link to those in the show notes. And you're doing more with the partnerships that DAT is adding a lot of value on those deals. And then we talked about how shippers are increasingly using DAT because of the DAT IQ. And last but not least, one of the few people in this world who knows exactly what the market's going to do. You told us what's happening in the market. Anyway, Ken, put a big old bow on this bad boy. Final thoughts.
I appreciate you having me. This was a super fun conversation. Glad we got to finally do it. We're gearing up to head down to Kansas City next week, depending on when this airs. It'll be next week. from when we're filming it for our annual user conference. We're going to have 500 of our closest friends, shippers, carriers, and brokers down there. It's always my favorite conference on the calendar because it's ours. And it's a lot more frontline practitioners, which is always fun. It's not the same old. We have 80% new faces generally each year, which is really, really fun. So again, thanks for having me. And maybe we'll come back on next year and see how well those predictions fared.
I would love that. So when is DATCon?
So it is, depending on who you are, because shippers come in a little bit earlier for a day. It's October 21st through...
One day of just shippers, right?
Yep. So Monday is just shipper. The shippers come in Monday for a Tuesday all-day event. So it's Monday, October 21st through Thursday, October 24th at the Westin in that Crown Center down there in Kansas City.
I can't go this year, but a number of people have said they're going to it. And I talked to your marketing team the other day, and I said, I want to go next year. It's just, I've already
It's great. Come on down. We can record live down there.
That's what I was thinking. So where is it next year? I know it's Kansas City this year.
I don't know. I don't know that we've released it publicly yet. It's a big secret.
Make it driving distance for us, Ken.
There's got to be. Well, actually, we don't golf at this one, but usually it's around a golf destination. I was determined to lobby for a freight city this year, and Kansas City is a freight city. So,
well, I think people, it definitely is, and I always think that people miss. If you're in Ohio, there's a lot of freight has to drive through Ohio. Anything from the north.
Oh yeah, I-90, I-80, 75.
Anything going from the automotive world up here down south has to go through. Anything from the northeast going to the south goes through Ohio. Not all of it, but a lot of it. Anyway, I'll put a link to your LinkedIn profile along with a link to your website and any other links you and your marketing team give me. And thank you so much for taking the time.
All right. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Yep. And thank all of you for listening to my podcast. Your support's very much appreciated. Until next time, onward and upward. You have been listening to the Logistics of Logistics podcast, where we engage with leaders in the logistics and supply chain community. If you like what you hear, please subscribe, hit the like button, and leave us a nice review on Apple or Spotify or wherever else you listen. Also, please check out our videos on YouTube and connect with us on LinkedIn. We're very big on LinkedIn. And you can also reach us on the logisticsoflogistics.com, our website.